Good evening and welcome to our Bible study on our Genesis study, our book-long study of the Genesis study. We have been in Genesis for 14 weeks. It doesn't really feel like it's been that long, but 14 weeks we have been through this Genesis study, and we have been digging and diving. Now, like I told you, the last couple of weeks, we have entered officially a new portion of the study. If you recall, we spent about 10 or so weeks talking specifically about the foundations of earth and mankind at large. And today we begin to take a little bit of specificity as we talk about Abraham and how Abraham became a friend of God. And what I highlighted last week is that Abraham was just a person like you and I. Abraham had doubts. Abraham leaned to his own understanding. He leaned to his own abilities. He walked in his own self, but he came into a knowledge, an assurance of God, and little by little he began to walk more faithfully with God. He understood. He came to see that God, and we're going to see certain characters come about that kind of influence Abraham's trust. And what I noticed about Abraham is that Abraham had this instinct that God was who he said he was. Abraham had this instinct that God was exactly who he said he was, but even in believing that God is who he said he was, there's an intimacy that develops that makes us understand exactly who that person is. And so while I can believe you are who you say you are, while I can believe that you can do what you say you can do, the more time I spend with you, the more we go through together, the more we effectively experience, it gives me a more complete picture of what you can do and who you are. And as an effect and as a result, we begin to see this kind of open up with Abraham. And so today's chapter kind of opens with a different set of characters. It opens with these kings who were doing what kings do. They were doing what kings and kingdoms do, the same way that song says, kings and kingdoms will all pass away, but there's something about the name, and of course it's talking about Jesus. They were doing what kings do. Kings conquer. Kings go to war. Kings want to build a name for themselves, and they want freedom and more power. And so the chapter opens up with a whole lot of mention of war. A lot of mention of war and territory and power and influence, and it just so happens that this touches Abraham's family. It doesn't really touch Abraham, but it touches those who Abraham is connected with. Now, if you remember last chapter, we talked about Abram and Lot's relationship. We talked about how at some point, especially last chapter, Abram had to have a conversation with Lot and say, hey, you being here is not God ordained. And you being here, I know I brought you here because I didn't want to let you go because you were the closest relative that I had. But you being here is causing strife among my house. You being here is causing chaos among my house. There are things that you being around are causing problems. And because you being around is causing problems, we got to go separate ways. We can't keep existing like this. Somebody's going to have to go to the left and somebody go to the right. But if we stay in the same spot on the same compound for this long anymore, we're going to end up killing each other. We're going to break out into war. And so they end it and they say, may the Lord watch between me and thee while we are absent one from another until we meet again. And remember, I reminded you and I kind of pressed the issue that just because they could not live together didn't mean that they were that they could no longer be family. It didn't mean that they didn't have love for one another. It didn't mean that he didn't love his nephew. It didn't mean that he was disowning his nephew. He just realized that you've gotten so big and I've gotten so big, and two big people in one space don't work. And while we're not talking about fat, we're talking about influence and the way that they govern their houses. And I think it's important to remember that they weren't governing houses of 4 people. They weren't governing households of 2 people. These were households of largeness. At some point when we think through some of these Bible legends and heroes, these guys owned so much that it was like they had a county. And when we look at the amount of land that we see Abram was given by God, it was more like Shelby County and Jefferson County, right? You got two really big counties. And so when he tells Lot, look to the left, look to the right, you pick which one you think you want, and I'll go to the right. If you choose the right, I'll go to the left. If you choose the left, I'll go to the right. And Abram looks out and he says, now that looks pretty. It's luscious and green. I can build me my house right over there. We can, ooh, I like that little river. It's running through there. And all my cows can stay out here. And we can really build something nice. And so Lot looks at that and he says, hey, I want that. And he goes down there close to Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Abram goes the opposite way, and he begins to reestablish his life, and he pitches his tent, and he builds his camp and his land and all of the things that go along with it in the opposite direction of Lot. Now, you remember just a couple of seconds ago, I was telling you, they said, may the Lord watch between me and thee while we are absent, one from another, until we meet again. It sounds familiar, right? It's the watchword. And especially in Baptist churches and churches all over this country, we have recited the watchword. We recited the watchword for years after the Bible study and after choir rehearsal and after meetings, and it was this go in peace. But the honest context of may the Lord watch between me and thee while we're absent one from another until we meet again means go away. We can't coexist here. And I want to pause here, and I want to point out something, that sometimes you've got to have a moment in your life where you say, look, in this space, this is not going to work. The toxicity of the relationship is not going to work. Now, in every situation, that doesn't mean the person is toxic. It means their existence in your space is toxic. It's kind of like this. If you got two babies in one mom, and the two babies don't have, one baby doesn't have a placenta, or one baby is taking hold of the placenta, you'll have one baby come out fully grown, and the other baby will come out malnourished because there wasn't enough to satiate both babies. Now, that doesn't go for every time you have a set of twins, but a lot of times that happens. Or if you have a situation where a baby is absorbed, so you have a set of twins, and the one twin absorbs the baby, it wasn't enough space, it wasn't enough nutrients, and being this close to one another was causing some issues. Every now and then you'll have some siblings that just can't get along, and they feel like there's not enough to go around. Every now and then you'll have issues in your business or in your church, and it will seem like there's not enough to go around, and because of such, at some point you got to have a separation to take place that says, hey, I got nothing but Jesus' love for you. I have nothing but peace and happiness. I pray the best. I hope God make his face to shine upon you, but we can't be together in this space. We can't be together in this space, and often we struggle with that. I remember early in college, I struggled with the idea that there would be some situations and some times when I would not be able to be friends with certain people anymore. That idea that we wouldn't be able to coexist in space, that idea that we couldn't talk it out and there was no amount of talking that was going to fix it, that idea I struggled with. And I think Satan exploits that. I think he does. I think he exploits that. He knows that we want to live peaceably with one another, and so he sends strife in to see, will you stay there until it drives you crazy? Will you stay there until nothing else can grow? You know, when you plant seed, we kind of see this in the parable of the wheat and the tares. When you plant seed and you've got good seed and weeds come in, it begins to suck the nutrients out of the good seed that you sowed. And so often enough, our lives are a reflection of that. God sowed good seed. We sowed good seed. And we're expecting a good harvest. But because the weeds are there among the seed that we planted, that the stuff that was supposed to grow never grew. The stuff that was supposed to blossom never blossomed. And as an effect, what happens is we never walk in the fullness of what God wanted. We never walk in the fullness of what God said, because somebody said along the way that all Christians had to get along. And while that's not true, there is a biblical reference here that says, may the Lord watch between me and you. So God can watch me if I go to the left and watch you when he goes to the left, and he can bless me on the left and bless you on the right. And just because we are apart doesn't mean that the blessing has left either one of us, but we realize that it's not going to work. Now, that don't work for your marriage. but moving on along. So today, Lot is living down in the plain, and he's living down in a plain close to Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, and Abram is off to the other side, and he's made his home on the other side. And here in our text, these kings have begun to do what kings do. And as these kings have begun to do what kings do, they have made up in them, they have come on a pact, and they have come together as a coalition of kings. And this coalition of kings, this coalition of kings has come together, and as they have come together, they have made up their they have made up their mind that as they come together, they're going to put Chedorlaomer, did I say that right? Or Chedorlaomer, I'm sorry. They're going to put him over the coalition of kings. And so I don't know what that meant. I don't know if that meant they paid taxes or they all came together under the army. But Chedorlaomer or Chedorlaomer, depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, they came together. And as these guys came together, they came together and made a pact, and they served Chedorlaomer for 12 years. For 12 years, they were subject to him, and it seems like they came up under an agreement, but at some point, this agreement went sour. It went south. It was not an agreement that was peaceable to everybody else. Everybody else was made subject to him, but it wasn't comfortable. Everybody was made subject to him, but it wasn't pretty. Everybody was made subject to him, but it wasn't an ideal situation. And because it was not an ideal situation, they found themselves in a place where they said, we don't have to stand for this anymore. And I want you to understand this. When a lot of times when we make up in our mind we don't have to stand for oppression anymore, there are often going to be situations and times when the person who is oppressing us is going to have a problem with that. Because if I was getting free labor, a free army, free increase, free crops, and then all of a sudden you want to take that apart because you want some rights, I wasn't giving you rights for the last 12 years. I didn't have to give you rights for the last 12 years. And while I was building my empire on your back, why would I give you freedom if you gave me free labor? If having you in bondage helped me build, helped me grow, why would I move forward? And so we see this coalition of kings, and while it doesn't give us many details on to why they decided to become a coalition of kings, at the 12th year, at the end of the 12th year, and when the 13th year arrived, they rebelled. They said, we're sick of this. We're sick of this. So let's read the text and let's see what's going on. I'm in the New Living Translation today because it's easy to read. About this time, war broke out in the region. King Amraphel of Babylonia, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goim, fought against King Beriah of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemeber of Zeboim, and King Bela of Zoar. The second group of kings joined forces in the Siddim Valley, that is the Valley of the Dead Sea. For 12 years, they had been subject to King Chedorlaomer. But in the 13th year, that's what I was talking about, they rebelled against him. 1 year later, Chedorlaomer and his allies arrived and defeated the Rephaites, the Ashtaroth, Karnaim, the Zuzites of Ham, the Emites at Shevek Kirithaim, and the Horites at Mount Seir, and all of El Paran at the edge of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, called Kadesh, and conquered all the territory of the Amalekites and of the Amorites, living in Hazazon Tamar. Then the rebel kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle in the valley of the Dead Sea. They fought against the king Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goim, King Amraphel of Babylonia, and King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. And as it happened, the valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits. And as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell in the tar pits. And while the rest escaped into the mountains, All right, so this war has taken place, and I want you to see that Sodom and Gomorrah gets the short end of this stick, and they begin to flee. And as Sodom and Gomorrah begins to flee, as they flee, many of them fall into these tar pits. If you've got an good old King James Bible, it may say bitumen pits. If you may have a different version of the Bible, it may say pitch pits. If you have a different version of the Bible, it may say asphalt pits. And basically, all that this is there's this tar that was very common back in prehistoric times, okay, or pre-biblical times. So they've got these this tar, and this tar is worse than sinking sand. That if you step in it, you get sucked into it and can't get out of it. It's not just mud, although it looks like mud. It's deceptive. It's powerful. And it reminds me a lot like sin. And I'm not drawing a type or a model. I'm just saying it reminds me of like sin. You step in sin, it looks like a mud puddle. Doesn't look like it's going to do much damage. It looks like if you wipe off your feet and you spray down your feet, that you'll be able to get the mud off. But the moment you step in it, it begins to suck you in. And the longer it sucks you in, the more you sink down. And as you sink down, before you know it, you're struggling to get up. You can't move your arms, can't move your hands. And before you know it, it's now covered your nose and your mouth, and now you can't breathe. And so it says some fell into tar pits. Some fell into bitumen pits. And they died. It was the thing that killed many animals of that day. It killed many men of that day. It suffocated them. It took away all of their lifeblood. And so it sucked many of them in, and then some of them ran into the mountains. And as many of them ran into the mountains, the victorious invaders plundered Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so they took all the stuff in Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them the spoils of war and the food supplies. And they also captured Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived in Sodom, and carried off everything he owned. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives Eshcol and Aner were Abram's ally. So all of this stuff has happened, and I'm sure that this war means absolutely nothing to you, but all of you need to know out of this that is important in these moments is that a war broke out, and Lot was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they plundered everything that he had. They took everything that he owned, all of his men, all of his things. They plundered his tent. They took his jewels, his rubies, his diamonds if they had them. He took his gold. They took his animals, his food, his plot, his crops, all of his things. They took it all. They took all of his stuff. And after they took all of his stuff, somebody escaped. And they went and they told Abram. Now, this is where my point about may the Lord watch between me and thee while we are absent one from another. There are some times where your friendship breaks up. You don't hate each other, but you can't exist in the same space anymore. We are friends from afar. And I've kind of got some of that going on in my life right now. I love you, but we don't talk every day. You are my buddy, but I ain't heard from you in a couple of years. But if something went wrong, if somebody called me and said that you needed me, said that we needed, that you were in desperate need, I want no ill to come of you. And so I'm on the way. How can I help? How can I go about this? My dad calls himself a rainy weather friend. You know, a lot of people talk about fair weather friends. Fair weather friends only show up when things are good, or they only call you when things are bad in their life. My dad calls himself a rainy day friend. And so he said he's the kind of friend that when you are really going through it, when you are really on your deathbed or you sit on your sick bed or things are really going wrong in your life, my dad is the kind of person that will go see you every single day. I know multiple people in our church who have been sick, in our church and his friend group that have been sick, and he go to the hospital every day. Or he'll call and check on them. Or he'll go and see about it. You know, it's kind of his MO. He's a rainy day friend. And as soon as he sees you're well, he goes back to normal. Goes back to normal and doesn't necessarily call you every day. But as soon as he hears something's wrong, he's coming to the rescue. It's kind of that, may the Lord watch. But you need me? I'm on the way. I'm on the way. And so Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, verse 14. And he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Then he pursued Chedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. There he divided his men and attacked during the night. Chedorlaomer's army fled, but Abram chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abram recovered all the goods that had been taken. He brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions and all the women and the other captives. Now, I want you to see this. I want you to understand this. War is going on. Chedorlaomer is kicking everybody's behind. He is building an empire. People who are rebelling against him are not getting to rebel. He's bringing them back. He is becoming a superpower. He's really got a whole lot of power that he has amassed. And I want you to see this. Armies of nations, armies of trained people are coming, and they are falling at the sword at Chedorlaomer's army's hands. But Abram shows up with 318 men. Now, it's amazing to me that he has a whole army in his household. That's crazy to me. It's a whole different type of living. He raises up an army out of his household, 318 men. Calls for them. They're militarized. He goes in there, calls on some of his allies, and then he goes and he says, all right, let's go get your stuff, Lot. He goes and he rescues his nephew and all of his stuff. Now, I know Abram is a bad boy. I understand that Abram has all kind of stuff that is impressive. I realize that Abram is one of the, Abram is the father of many nations. Abram, we look at Abraham as somebody who we look up to. But I want you to understand that logically, this don't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's like those scenes in the movie where one person shows up and they beat 20 people. Logically, it doesn't make sense. Logically, it just doesn't make sense. And so this next portion of our study today addresses how Abram was able to do such a thing. We see this other guy pop up. Verse 17. After Abram returned from his victory over Chedorlaomer and all his allies, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. And Melchizideck, the king of Salem, and the priest of the God the Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Now Melchizideck blessed Abram with this blessing: Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. Let's stop here. Melchizideck. Now, I know I feel like I say this every week. If you have spent any amount of time in Sunday school, you've heard about Melchizideck. And if you're like me, and you probably are not, but if you are, you've probably done your reasonable amount of searching trying to understand who exactly is Melchizideck. And you might have found some mention about him in Hebrews, saying that that Christ was of the order and the line of Melchizideck, and that he was without a lineage and without mother and without father. But Melchizideck was both king and priest. And so this man who is both king and priest, who comes before the line of Aaron, when it is encouraged that kings and priests not mix, and even in our society, we want church and state to be separate. But who is this man who is both king and priest? Come on, Holy Spirit. Who is this man who is both king and priest? Who is this man who can both govern and pray? Who is this man who can reach out to man and both reach out to God? Who is this man who has bridged this gap in society? Who is this man? Melchizideck. Now, Melchizideck was the king of Salem. Salem is where Jerusalem is, okay? Salem means peace. Jerusalem means new peace, means peace, home of peace. So Salem, he was the king of Salem before the Jeru was added. And the king of Salem, this king and priest, brings out bread and wine to sup with Abram. Now, this is very much so typical of Christ. Okay, this is very much so typical of Christ. You can see the fingerprints all over it, even before we think about the Passover meal. If we look down through the text, he brings both bread and wine like they're going to have communion. He brings out bread and peace, bread and wine, and they sup together. And I think, as somebody who has received Christ and has studied the Passover and has studied communion and has studied all of these things, it is obvious, it jumps out from the text for me. But if I'm Abram, I don't know that there's going to be a Passover. If I'm Abram, I don't know there's going to be shedding of blood. If I'm Abram, I don't know that these things are coming. I don't have a clue about this. And so I think that's what's so beautiful about reading the text, that we get to read the text with an understanding of what has happened in the future from the text. Okay? Now, so most people there is no idea how Melchizideck came to Canaan from Canaan, because he's a man without origin. There's a lot of people, scholars, that I don't necessarily know if I agree with it, but they believe that Melchizideck was a unblemished being, maybe a Christophany, but somebody who popped up at some point that was unblemished, unsinned. I don't know if I agree with that. That we don't see any proof of that in the text. Now, and it's unclear how Melchizideck came to know and trust the one true living God, but scholars talk about it's untrue to know how he came to trust or understand the one true living God, but I think we would have to ask the same question of a Moses, of a Job, of an Abram, and of an Enoch, because basically God just chose to show himself to them because they had a heart that would receive him. All right. But I want you to see this. He was a priest of the Most High God, and he blessed Abram, and he blessed God. Now, you remember last week, was it last week or week before last, I made a big deal about the proximity, and when they got in proximity, he built an altar because he made up in his mind that he was going to bless God, although God had promised to bless him. And Melchizedek coming back reinforces that is a biblical construct, that our response should be to both bless God and to bless man. I want to even go a little bit further, because most of my Republican friends, and I'm not Republican nor Democrat, I sit somewhere in the middle of the line, but my Republican friends often have a lot of issue with giving to man, and then my Democrat friends have a lot of issue with giving to God, but we see this example of giving, to being able to give to both man and to give to God, but to be able to bless man and to bless God. There's an importance here that even reaches to the New Testament, that says to love God and to love people. Love the Lord your God with all your might, your strength, with all of your strength and your might, with all of your soul. And then to love your neighbor as yourself. We get this example, we get this instruction by God that we are to love God and to love people, that I don't ever have to stop loving God when I love people, and I don't have to stop loving people when I love God. And what I've learned is that legalism and modern politics would suggest that I've got to choose one. Modern politics would suggest that if I'm a Christian, I don't care about people. Or maybe rather, I guess modern liberalism would say that I have to love people, and maybe I can't love God if I love people. And then modern conservatism would say that I have to love God, and sometimes that means I can't love people. But we see this example that we have this example to love God, to love people, to bless God, to bless people. And we see that both of these people are extremely blessed because they bless God and they bless people. And so I can give to the United Way, but I can also give my tithe. Do you see what I'm saying? I can love my friends that love differently than I do, and I can also read my Bible and trust in God and love my God and love my Christian friends. I can see somebody who has sinned and is in prison and has found themselves in a hole. I can love them as myself. I can treat them as myself, but I can still also love God, that we don't have to make a gulf in it. And the idea that we do is legalism. But I'm going to stop. But Melchizedek blesses God, and he blesses man. He says this. He says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, a priest of the Most High God, brought Abram bread and wine. And Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. So I told you we got a little bit of insight into how Abram was able to take an army of 318 people and fight a war that against folks who were fighting wars and battles against all these different nations and winning, popping everybody off, keeping everybody under subjection. He was able to go and fight because what does Melchizedek say? He says, blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. Abram didn't have nothing to do with that. It didn't matter how well trained his 318 warriors were. Didn't matter how great his army was. Didn't matter how skilled they were. It was simply the fact that God defeated his enemies for him. Then something happens. And this is going to probably hurt somebody's feelings. Something happens. Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all goods he had recovered. Then Abraham gave Melchizedek of all goods he had recovered. The King James says, and then Melchizedek Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all he had. Now, I'm inclined to believe the King James is probably more accurate, because this New Living Translation would suggest that Abram only gave him a tenth of all the things that he had just inquired. But the King James would suggest that he took all that he had and gave him a tenth. Now, I want you to see this. Two things are established, because everybody wants to say that tithing is an old covenant, and we'll say in the New Testament, Old Testament, an old covenant construct. The old covenant has not been established. The law is not in effect yet. We haven't even got the 10 Commandments yet. We haven't gotten the 10 Commandments yet. Abram is simply building a relationship with God. And I want to stop there before I even go down the road of tithing. Before I ever go down there, before I ever park there, I want to go here. I want to go here. I don't even remember where I wanted to go. But before that, I guess God didn't want me to go there. We'll stop there. But then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all goods he had recovered. Before there was ever a law, the inclination to give to the priest and to God a tenth was established. That's where tithing comes from. Tithing, although it's in the law, does not come from the law. That concept came from Abram. When Abram saw the priest of God, he out of obedience, not because he asked for it, but obedience of his heart, he gave 10%. And I want you to see the heart of what happens here. Melchizedek offers a blessing to Abram. Abram offers a blessing to Melchizedek. And it was almost as if they were in competition with who can bless the other person better. Can I go a little bit further? That if you would take the heart of, can I bless God? Can I bless God's people? Can I bless God's house? Can I bless the people of the world? Let's see who can bless the other person more. I guarantee this. We would be more blessed than we are. A lot of us walk around with our fists clenched so tight with the little bit that we have no room to receive. So they bless each other. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, give back my people who were captured. But you may keep for yourself all the goods you recovered. Abram replied to the king of Sodom, I solemnly swear to the Lord God, Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take so much as a single thread or sandal thong from what belongs to you. Otherwise, you might say, I am the one who made Abram rich. I will only accept what my young warriors have already eaten and request that you give a fair share of my goods to my allies, Aner, Ishol, and Mamre. So something else happens. So this concept of tithing takes place. He encounters Melchizideck, and then Melchizideck affirms to Abram who he's been talking to. Like, Abram has been hearing from God, but he has really not a recollection of exactly who God is. God has said, look at the stars, I'm going to give you that. Look at the sand on the seashore, I'm going to give you that many kids. I'm going to do these things for you. When you got on this land, now this is the land that I'm going to bring them in. They're going to be a nation. He's given them this idea. He's breathing and making them known, but I think Abram and his experience with God is still developing. I think that's why last chapter he goes to Egypt. I think that's why when he leaves he goes, instead of going to Canaan, he comes to Haran. That he stops short of it. I think that's why he takes his father and his nephew with him the first few times. I think that he's still developing his experience of God. He's still learning how to trust God, how to walk with God, how to move with God. And I want to encourage somebody who's still trying to figure out how to walk with God. Still trying to figure out how to move with God, how to trust God, how to believe God, how to do these things. I want you to understand that if Abram had to go through a process to trust, believe, and understand God, that, baby, you're not going to get this overnight. That walking completely right in his ways, that's going to be a whole life thing. I got a good friend. She's got a phrase that she says, you're going to grow to the grave. I'm growing to the grave, that if I stop growing, I'm dying. And so I'm growing to the grave. I'm reading. I'm learning. I'm evolving. My mind is evolving. I'm becoming. I'm continuing to become because I'm growing to the grave. And there are some things that I believed at one point in my life I can't believe now because I know better. And I'm doing better. So as I'm knowing better, I'm doing better. As I'm believing better, I'm experiencing better. As I'm walking better, I'm getting better. I want you to see what I'm saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that there was a process that took place in Abram's life. Now, then Abram, the king of Sodom says, give back my people who were captured, but you can keep for yourself all the goods you have recovered. Abram says, the king says, give me my people back, but you can keep all this stuff. I think that since you rescued us, I think that's fitting. But then Abram said, that's not going to work. Because you got to understand, Abram's now understanding that the Most High God is the God I've been communing with, and I'm meeting somebody who knows him. I've been around people who don't believe him. I've been around people who don't know he exists, but I'm meeting somebody who knows he exists. I'm meeting somebody who understands what I understand, and I'm coming into the fullness of who he is. And since I'm developing this, I know that you will not be getting credit for what God has done. So I tell you what, my men, let them keep a little bit, but I won't take none of this plunder because I don't want ill-gotten gains, and I don't want nobody to get the credit for what God is doing in my life but God. And I know you'll be the one to say that I made Abram rich. And since I know that, I won't take anything. Because when I get rich or I get richer, I want God. I want God to get the glory. I want God to get the glory and the praise. And if it ain't God that's getting the glory and the praise, I don't want it. And so Abram walks away from the plunder. He had an opportunity to be even more wealthy. And I'm learning more and more by the day that Satan, like he tempted Abram and he tempted Jesus in the wilderness, will tempt you by giving you ill-gotten gains, trying to give you wealth in places you don't need it, give you things that God never ordained for you. And so this morning, this evening, whatever time you're watching this, I want you to make the prayer, Lord, teach me how to evolve in you. Teach me how to walk with you. Teach me how to understand you better. Teach me, oh God, to have a better understanding of who you are and what you want me to be. Because as he got a better understanding, God reveals himself then the more. I think encountering Melchizideck was probably one of the most foundational and monumental things that happened in his life. because it better revealed to him who exactly God was. He fought that battle because he was going to rescue his nephew, but he got a victory he didn't deserve. And then before he could have the opportunity to think that it was me that fought that battle, he's encountering this king and priest who knows God and speaks up and says, praise be to God for how he fought your enemies, because we know that wasn't you. My prayer this morning, this evening, is that God will open your eyes, help you to see him in the fullness of his power, help you to understand what he's called you to, what he's calling you through, and what he's walking you into. My prayer this evening is that as you encounter people, that your eyes would be open to receive God and to discern evil kings. Y'all be blessed. Let's pray. Oh, gracious God, I thank you for your grace. God, as I've been grateful all day for your peace that surpasses all understanding, God, I pray that you'd let us wallow in it. God, let us sit in it. I know Satan wants us to wallow in depression and anxiety, but God, my prayer this evening is that somebody in their home would start to wallow and sit and ruminate in peace. That the peace of God, which does not have to make sense, would surpass their understanding, God. That it would hold them in the cradle of your arms, that it would rock them to sleep, God. That your peace would cover them, God, that it would rain down and rest firmly on them. God, that those of us who are righteous and that have made our ways to please you, God, that you would make even our enemies at peace with us. That enemies who have spoken ill against us, God, that we would find that they were making peace with us, God. That we would find situations where that we would walk into blessing and there would be peace, God, and there would be grace, God, and there would be mercy found, God. I thank you this evening. Don't deserve anything. My prayer for your saints this evening is that we would know you better, love you deeper, seek you more, and be more like you. God, we praise you. We worship you. In Jesus' name, amen.